I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. This is episode 51. I'm here with Jennifer Frey, who I saw on EWTN recently. She was interviewed by Father Mitch Pacwa, and somebody wrote to me, one of the Pontifex University students wrote to me and said, "You should have this person on your podcast." So here she is. I contacted her. It's great to see you, Jennifer. Welcome to the Way of Beauty podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so other than you were on EWTN, and I saw what you spoke there about virtue and happiness, and you have a background in philosophy, and also you talk about literature very knowledgeably and with great insight. And the fact that you live in South Carolina, I know very little about you. So could you begin, please, by just telling us a little bit of your story, especially your story in faith? The other thing I do know is you're a convert. And as a convert myself, I'm always interested to know what draws people into the church. And then, having come, how that stimulates the interest they have once they get there.
Yeah, converts are a special group of people. So currently, I'm a philosophy professor here at the University of South Carolina. So I live in Columbia, South Carolina. We're in the middle of the state. I have 6 kids. I'm also married to a philosopher. How did I get here? Well, I was not raised Catholic. In fact, I was not raised a Christian at all. I was raised in a religiously indifferent household. And when I went to university, I went to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I decided that I really wanted to study philosophy in a serious way. So I was kind of a weird undergraduate in an American context because most Americans go to college like mostly to make friends or to party or whatever. But I really...
Quite a few British people as well.
Yeah. Right. And for me, for whatever reason, I just, I did a lot of partying in high school, and it was just, to me at that point, it was boring. And I was very invested in my education. And at any rate, I fell in love with philosophy, which happens to people. And I started, for the first time in my life, I realized that I was stupid and I didn't know anything, which is the first thing that any philosopher must realize, that you actually don't know anything. Like anything you thought you understood, you don't. And so I went through this, period of sort of terrifying confusion. And for the first time was asking myself the really hard, basic, foundational questions about what I was, what sort of thing I was, and why I was here, and whether there was a point to it all. And at any rate, I happened to fall in love with medieval philosophy in particular. I was very taken with Boethius. So in my medieval philosophy class, we had read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy.
Right.
Which is a wonderful book, sorely neglected, but it's a wonderful text. And really, it's a text about happiness. It's a text about,
yes,
the human person, what the human person is, and what could perfect that kind of thing, or what could fulfill or satisfy in the deepest way the kind of thing that a human person is. And I was really struck by this. And then eventually I started studying, Plato and Aristotle, but also Aquinas. And I eventually got my hands on this book by a Swiss Dominican theologian called Servais Pincers. And the book was titled The Sources of Christian Ethics. And the basic thesis of the book is that the point of the moral life is to be happy. And so the primary concepts of the moral life are happiness, right, as the goal, that you're striving to reach or attain, but also the virtues, because the virtues are supposed to be those qualities or characters of the soul that will make you such as to be able to attain this end. And this was like incredibly mind-blowing to me. As an 18-year-old young person, I didn't have sophisticated thoughts about morality. I had opinions. I probably couldn't really successfully defend any of my opinions if my life depended on it, but I had very strong opinions. And the framework for thinking about the moral life not only made sense to me, it seemed very coherent and intelligible, but it was also deeply attractive to me because I had always thought of morality as just a set of rules that governed us, and maybe like a set of duties. But it didn't have anything to do with happiness or satisfaction. And maybe, in fact, doing the right thing would make you unhappy, but you would be a good person. So the idea that being a good person and being a happy person were not only compatible, but had to be understood as essentially related, this had literally never occurred to me. And it definitely never occurred to me that that's what the Christians thought. Because, yeah.
I'm going to come in here and say it's amazing that you got these insights, because this actually, in a different way, is what drew me into the church.
Oh, okay, yeah.
What was the belief that I would be happy? I get people asking me all the time, why did you, or actually, when I often talk to children, I say, why do you think I became Catholic? And a lot of them will say, because it's true. No one says, because you thought you'd be happier. And,
right.
and that's the point I want to make. And when I got into the church, I discovered, and I don't think many Catholics believe that either, even though they have the essence of it there. They have greater access to it than anyone else.
Right. No, I mean, that was really, so there were a lot of things that sort of scandalized and shocked me once I actually met Catholics. So yeah. I didn't grow up around Catholics. And I had so it was all incredibly foreign to me, but then I fell in love, with these sort of great doctors of the church. I didn't mention Augustine, but Augustine also was someone that I the Confessions really fundamentally changed my life. And of course, that's also a book about happiness. But it's definitely true that if you just sort of randomly picked a Catholic, off the streets, and you were like, so why do you have to follow the 10 Commandments? The idea that they're going to say because it would make me be happy is pretty far-fetched, right? I mean, who knows what they would say? Probably they would say because God commanded it or something, which is, there's a sense in which it's true, but there's also a sense in which it's a tautology. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't reveal anything. And so I was, shocked, impressed, attracted to this view. And so, I was just sort of reading everything that I could, and I was grappling with these questions about, God and the soul. And to make a very long story short, I eventually decided to become a Roman Catholic. So I was baptized and received into the church just before I turned 20 years old. But it was definitely through philosophy. I'm sort of one of the weirdos that just read my way into the Catholic faith. And the priest, the poor priest, in Southern Indiana that I went to, I'm just throwing all of this patristic theology at him and all these questions. And he's just I don't know, but have you ever been to Mass? And I'm no. And he's maybe you should go.
Yeah. Well, I must admit, when we started this conversation, I thought we were going to go into literature, but I am so fascinated by what you just told me. I've just got to come back at you. We'll do that first, I think.
Okay, that's fine.
That is wonderful. First of all, I read Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy before I came into the church, and I just thought it was an amazing thing. He was this man in a very, very difficult situation, arguing, telling me that I should be happy. I was miserable. And this guy was telling me how to be happy effectively. He was giving me some insights. And I'm just going to throw something to you about there's two things that I want to really explore. One is the nature of happiness itself and what it is. Is it a difficult thing to know what it is when we have it? I don't think it is, but I want to explore that. And then the other is the role of this in evangelization. And I think that exactly as you said, this is something that's often struck me, that morality is a roadmap to happiness. And this is what we should be selling in the church. It's what drew me in. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to throw something at you here that very often in discussions about, for example, gay marriage. I live in the East Bay, San Francisco area. So all the time I'm coming across people who are living lifestyles that are definitely not according to the teaching of the church. And if any of them ever ask me about it, what I try to say to them is, look, you're free to do what you want. I don't want to interfere with your freedom. Mm-hmm. But what I believe, if you ask me, is that if you follow the teachings of the church, whatever happiness and joy you have through what your current lifestyle, which I'm not going to argue against, I'm sure you're deriving satisfaction from it. Everything that you say, I'll take at face value. But what is on offer to you is something even greater, even better. And if you're prepared to follow the morality of the church and maybe sacrifice one or two of the things that you're doing, actually what would be opened up to you is something that's even greater. Now, is that a reasonable argument, would you say?
Well, I mean, I think it depends, because I think it's, when stated at that level of generality, it's true, but it's not really getting at what the alternative actually is. And I think, you could have the same conversation, and in fact, it would be far more interesting with almost any just Catholic couple. Yes. So, because I think, what are the numbers? Like 90% of Roman Catholics contracept. Yes. So actually, that's the exact same sin that we're talking about.
Yes.
So, right. And what is the problem? Well, now we're talking about chastity. Like, that's a virtue.
Yes.
And so what's really, really, really difficult for everyone, not just gay people, there's like no need to single them out because it's everyone. What everyone has a hard time with is the idea that the sexual act is the reproductive act. And that when you have sex solely for the sake of pleasure, when you render the act through whatever means, there are many ways you could make sex completely intentionally infertile. Some of those ways involve technology and some don't, but like, however you do that, then you're destroying one of the essential or fundamental goods that act is meant to bring into your life. And then you make it about bodily pleasure for the people involved in the act. And that's something that last time I checked, like, everyone struggles to see. And just speaking as someone who's written about chastity, I think that the place to start is to get people to think about what our sexuality is for. Like, what is its role in human life? Is it about pleasure and pleasing ourselves? Or all of virtue, virtue functions so as to take us outside of ourselves and connect us to goods that transcend the self. Like, that's how I understand virtue. And when we cut off human sexuality from the family and reproduction, then we are cutting off its self-transcendent character. It's no longer about a common good, but just about private pleasure. And there's not a single virtue that's just about private pleasures.
Yes.
And so we lose the self-transcendent character of virtue. I think that's a difficult conversation to have. But I think that's how you have to talk. You have to talk about the specific virtue.
I see.
Why we need to be disciplined with respect to our sexual appetites, and disciplined so as to make them ordered to something that transcends the self.
Right. And of course, that's, as you say, that's a difficult conversation unless they're willing to listen and explore that with you. They need to be open.
That's right. And my experience is that nobody is. I mean, very few people, including very few Catholics, are sort of happy to have a conversation about the church's teaching on sex.
I'm going to say that some are, and that how can we open people up? Well, the answer is if they see in us as people something that they think they haven't got, they may be curious. It happens occasionally, I think.
Yeah, that's true. So I think, I have a large family, and it's like, on the one hand, people think that's like weird and crazy, but then on the other hand, they also think it's beautiful. But yeah, I think you do bear a sort of burden of, maybe burden is an unhappy word choice, but yeah, I think that if you are trying to convince someone to live a certain way, then they better not look at your own life and be like, wow, that looks really terrible.
But also, it's in the way that we relate personally. I'm thinking that if I strive to do this, I don't need to concede any of the points that you've made and stop being gracious and loving and considerate and patient and so on. All those things with the people that I'm dealing with. And
right.
I think if they see that in you, and this is a high standard to aim for, but that what it comes down to is the first step is for me then to look at myself. And
right.
People don't see that in me, just in the way that I am. That is the greatest thing that I can do. And they may never ask me. We may never get to that conversation, but potentially it might strike somebody, and they will start to be curious and perhaps start reading privately. And what is it that Jennifer had? What is it that David has? They're able to do this. By the way, thank you. That was a beautiful description of virtue, which I hadn't heard before. And I'm going to replay this and try and memorize it, should anyone ever ask me the question.
Sure.
Unfortunately, won't happen very often, as you say. But anyway, unless it's at a podcast. But let's talk about what happiness is. I think it's simple. I think we all, even if we can't say what it is, we all know what it is when we have it. But it's not all. It doesn't always seem to be presented in that way. So,
yeah. Look, I'm a philosopher, so I don't think anything is simple. So be careful. I think that happiness is a slippery concept, and I think that happiness, just as a word in the English language, has a lot of baggage. So it actually comes from hap, right? Which is sort of like luck. So it's sort of written into the etymology that this is something that you might have just by good fortune or something. And that's reflected in how we use the word sometimes. And so I think we have to disambiguate or distinguish between light or shallow uses of happiness,
Yes.
which I think are legitimate uses. I don't want to say, oh, you've just misapplied a concept or something.
Yes.
But there's a big difference between shallow happiness or what, frankly, I might call false happiness, and what I would call deep happiness or true happiness or something like this. So, and in my own thoughts about happiness, I'm drawing on Aquinas, the Aristotelian tradition more generally. But the basic idea is that happiness is something like human fulfillment, perfect human fulfillment, such that if you were in such a condition, then there would be no remainder, nothing left. You would be fully satisfied, right? So it's sort of like if you're really thirsty and you have, a big tall glass of cold water, then you drink until you're satisfied. But you're going to be thirsty again, right? It's only going to last for so long. Humans need to keep replenishing their thirst. But the idea of happiness is something that would satisfy you, and you're not going to become depleted again or something. You're just going to be perfectly satisfied. And Aquinas calls that perfect happiness. And he thinks of that in terms of beatitude, and he thinks that only God can give you that, because our perfect happiness is communion with God. But Aquinas also thinks that there's imperfect happiness, and that's what we're talking about in this life. And imperfect happiness is pretty awesome. So it's not as great as perfect happiness, but it's pretty great, right? So, and when we're talking about imperfect happiness, we're talking about what humans can attain for themselves through the exercise of their own human abilities. So this is where Aquinas distinguishes between natural virtue and theological virtue. So for Aquinas, the cardinal virtues are natural virtues. So this is justice, prudence, fortitude, and temperance. And then all of the virtues, all of the subordinate virtues that fall underneath those categories.
Yeah.
And then there's theological virtue. Natural virtue orients you to a common good, namely the happy life of the community. So happiness for Aquinas at any level is never something that solely attaches to an individual. It's always a common good, where that means that it's common to all human beings, right? It's the good common to you all in virtue of your nature. It's common in the sense that it's not competitive. So if I am trying to be happy in the right sort of way, then it doesn't in any way detract from your possibility of being happy. So it's not like the milk in the store, right? The milk in the store is going to run out. Maybe I'll buy, maybe my purchasing the milk in the store competes with your ability to get it. Happiness isn't like that. Okay, so it's not a competitive good. It's not a zero-sum game. And then finally, if it's a common good, it's participatory. And that means that you participate in and you enjoy the good in common with others. And that's why for Aquinas, even at the level of natural virtue, the basic conception of the moral life is a life of friendship. It's a life of communion with other persons. And friendship is the context. Friendships, where that's understood capaciously to include every loving relationship. You need virtue because the friend wills the good of the other, right? And friends share lives and they share activities, right? So they participate in these goods. That's all at the level of natural virtue, but then we have to talk about theological virtue, which orders a human person to God as their final perfect end. And that, of course, would be faith, hope, and love. And so there's a difference in the object, but there's also a difference in how you get the virtue. So for natural virtue, you get it by doing the virtuous things. such that you become habituated, in a sense, to doing those things. And ideally, you get to the point where you enjoy doing those things. So if I'm a just man, then I repay my debts. But I don't repay my debts and sort of like wish that I hadn't or feel bad about it. I gladly repay my debts. Now, with theological virtue, those are divinely given to me through the sacraments and through the workings of grace. So there's a different sort of causal etiology at work there. And so you can't have them, like, no matter how hard you work, or no matter how much natural virtue you have, if you're not receiving and cooperating with God's grace, you're not going to have faith, hope, and love. And it's interesting.
Yes. I just want to come in there and just make that. So it's faith, hope, charity, or faith, hope, love. Are those?
Yeah, caritas, love in the sense of caritas. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Where caritas is love of God and love of neighbor through God.
And then the natural virtues are temperance, justice,
fortitude, and practical wisdom.
What was the final one?
Prudence, prudentia, or practical wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. It's funny, I list them every day, and then when I'm on the spot, I can't remember. So there's a nice number of 7. Everything comes nicely in 7s in the church. So I
also 7 deadly sins.
By design, or is it just part of the pattern of the musical harmony, as we just described? Which I love, by the way. Everything conforms to this sort of pattern of harmony and beauty.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing to say about happiness is, just to make a couple more distinctions, because I'm a philosopher, Aquinas recognizes a distinction between like a formal sense of happiness and a material sense of happiness. So formally, happiness is just defined as that end or goal for the sake of which you act. So you desire and you act that perfects you or fulfills you.
Yeah.
But then the question is, okay, but what is that goal, right? And that would be your material conception of happiness. What vision of happiness are you actually operating under in your practical deliberation and your choices? Do you think that the good life is the life of pleasure? Do you think it's the life of wealth and power? Do you think it's the life of honor, or, et cetera, et cetera? And so Aquinas says, well, formally speaking, everyone's the same. Everyone wants to be happy.
Yep.
And everyone operates under some vision of happiness that guides their deliberation. But materially speaking, there's like a lot of disagreement, right? And some people have incredibly false visions of what it is to be happy, and they make disastrous choices and their lives don't go well. So there's that distinction too. And it's sort of important to keep that in mind when we're talking about happiness, that we have formal, material, we have imperfect, perfect, and then we also have shallow versus deep happiness.
Yes. And the misconception, if I'm understanding what you say, comes in that, I think that even these lesser forms of happiness are authentically happiness, but the problem is if we mistake them for the perfect, if you like, the one we're striving for.
So I think that a lot.
Right.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people get stuck at sort of a lower level, right? So they get stuck in base pleasures. But I think we have to be careful, because some people who get stuck at that lower level are truly unhappy people, right? So people who become addicted to pornography or become alcoholics or something like this. They're still like, when they're high or when they are engaged in watching pornography, like, yeah, they're experiencing pleasure. But even they aren't confused anymore that it's making them happy, right? I mean, they sort of like most addicts are self-aware that this is
Yes.
like really bad. But the trouble is they can't, they sort of lack, they fundamentally lack the self-control necessary to progress in the moral life. Um,
I,
I mean, but on the other hand, you sort of have these characters who are like, you know, the happy glutton. So just earlier today, I was leading under I am reading Dante's Divine Comedy with undergrads this year. So we're still early in the Inferno, and today we were reading Canto 6, which is the gluttons, right? So Dante is down in like the fourth ring of hell, and he meets this glutton. I guess Chaco is his name, and you know, Chaco was saying to him, like, when I was alive, you know, I really enjoyed food and it was so great. But now, right, he's sort of stuck down in the mud, and he can't get up, and he lives literally like a beast in hell. This is his just punishment for living the life that he did. But you do get this sense that, like, when he was on earth, you know, he was enjoying it. So I don't want to deny that. And I don't want to deny that someone like that can think that they're living well. Most vicious people think that they're living well, but they're not. Whatever sort of happiness that they have, it's shallow, and it is false in the sense that it is radically incomplete in terms of the sorts of goods available to a human being, but it also almost always contravenes or makes impossible the attainment of higher goods.
yes. So that's, I can see that. So that if our desire for the perfect happiness, which should be the homing signal, if you like, is transferred to one of these lesser forms, then that causes problems. And I'm just thinking of my own experiences. What part of what led me, I'm talking about this actually at the moment with a series of talks at the Institute of Catholic Culture. Part of what led me to the church was, I was extremely unhappy, and I met someone who offered me a way out. And I won't go, if you want the story, you can go to the Institute of Catholic Culture. But what you describe about this struggle between seeking distraction, which is what I was doing in my 20s, through superficial pleasure, and really at various times, almost what would happen is if I just paused to think for a moment about my real situation, I would just be overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness and despair. I knew I wasn't happy,
right,
deep down, and I was conscious. The way you described that, you know, I was conscious of that. Now, I might have denied it if you'd asked me. My pride had to be battered before I was prepared to admit that.
Right.
And at various times, I could be so taken with the distraction of the superficial pleasures that I was chasing that I might convince myself that it was okay. But it didn't take much for me to realize eventually, shall we say, or it became pretty clear that I couldn't live my life on this basis, which is what the hedonist tries. So basically, I was a pretty poor hedonist. I wasn't very good at it. I would say I couldn't. You know, I just look at the way some people pursued it.
You were an untalented hedonist.
Yeah, untalented. Yeah. I was unprincipled hedonist, but and that was my great blessing, I would say. But it became clear to me that this wasn't the answer, and to be even 24 hours a day, or all of my waking hours, to be distracted would not satisfy. I realized that, and I would try it. You know, when I started off on that life, and it began in college, by the way. So I'd have loved the university you went to for all the wrong reasons, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it within by the time I was 26, so I went to college at 18. I pursued all the wrong things. It was really clear to me that I did not know how to fulfill that inner desire. And by a chance meeting, I was shown a way that eventually, it began then at 26, but at the age of 31, I was received into the church. But it really was this question of happiness and this recognition in me. I had never heard any of the beautiful things you've just told us, but I think you don't need to, it's just like beauty, you don't need to know what it is to recognize it when you see it. And with happiness, untutored as I was philosophically, I could recognize at some level exactly what you're saying, and I knew I needed to look somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. And I think that goes back to what you were asking, which I never got to, which is, how does happiness interact with evangelization?
Yes.
And I think that, so what's interesting to me about your story is that even Aristotle would have recognized your constant need for distraction as like a coping mechanism or a strategy to deal with the fact that you were not in a good position, right? So because what does the distracted soul not want? They don't want to enter into a place of solitude and silence, because that's the place of self-reflection.
Yes.
And that's a very scary place if you're a vicious person. And Aristotle says in one of his books on friendship that vicious people never want to be alone because they're not friends with themselves, right? Because actually they hate themselves. But they sort of like constantly distract themselves so that they don't have to think about it. And I think there's a deep truth there about human beings that even Aristotle saw. And I think that to me, the role of philosophy generally, and this is from my own experience, but I also just think if you look at it historically and objectively, this is one of the ways that it functions. Philosophy is always a call to contemplation, to solitude, to this kind of probing self-reflection. And that's always good for someone. Now, it's not a guarantee of anything, because there are plenty of philosophers who ended up saying, false things, even terrible things.
Yes.
But the search for truth, the desire for truth, the search for truth, that is like most fundamentally the path to a relationship with God. And so I think that when we call people to ask these hard questions, to think about things like, well, actually, what is happiness? Like, have you ever asked yourself what will actually make you happy? Now let's consider the things in your life that you're going for. Are these the kinds of things that could really fulfill a human being? Well, that invites the question, well, actually, what is a human being, right? How are we to understand the human being? Can we understand the human being just materially, et cetera, right? So once we get into this space, the space of philosophy, these are all just philosophical questions that any human can ask themselves, any mature, reflective human can ask themselves. That I think is a really important entryway into getting people to take a look or to consider the Christian intellectual tradition, the Christian vision of the human person. And it will either connect with them as it did with us. There was nothing in my background that anyone could look at and say, oh, she was already on her way to Catholicism. Like, it was an absolute rejection of the way I grew up, what my parents believed, what I was taught, my environment. But I became a Catholic because I thought it was true. And I think, that's how humans function in the good case. When you see that something is true, you have to obey it.
Yeah.
You have to follow that. You can't turn your back from it without it being disastrous.
And it would be a perverse world where following that truth wasn't also consistent with that desire for happiness as well.
That's right. That's right. It would be an unhappy situation if it were mere luck, right? That following the truth is what could make you happy.
True or happy, that there is no difference there. I'm going to suggest just follow up with, having described what I used to be like, what I feel now, what Catholicism, what the church offers me, Christianity, is the reverse situation. So it's quite possible, life does not go my way all the time. And so I can be unhappy about this, or wish that this was different, or and sometimes extremely unhappy. Things don't go my way. But if I pause for a moment and reflect on my situation, I can say, well, despite that, I am happy. That
Right.
I have a general sense that it's going to be okay. There is a consolation there which allows me to transcend those things. So it's the exact reverse of what it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that people struggle with, and especially Catholics, is how to think about happiness in light of suffering. So some people, when I try to talk to them about happiness, they're like, well, but we're supposed to pick up our cross and carry our cross.
Yes.
And look at the life of Christ. Like, at the end, was he unhappy? Like, how are we supposed to think about evil and suffering, given that we all suffer and it looks unfair? And now you're telling me that I should be happy. And I think these are really good and important questions. And I think one of the reasons why it becomes confusing to people is that we have lost the vocabulary, or we have lost the proper framework for thinking about suffering. So we no longer think of suffering as an opportunity to grow in virtue, especially to grow in faith, hope, and charity. So to take our suffering, one, as part of the providential order of things, and two, as an opportunity to be united with the suffering of Christ and Mary and the saints, and as really a way to grow in virtue. And I think until we recover in our vocabulary and ways of speaking and ways of thinking, until we recover a place for thinking about sacrifice in that way, it is always going to just seem like a dichotomy, right? Like it's either suffering or it's happiness, but it couldn't possibly be both.
I always think of this question of Christ on the cross. Was he suffering? I mean, he was in agony, so that his sweat was blood even prior to that. And this is just a personal view, that I think that he took on himself in the Passion all my unhappiness that I leave behind in the confessional. He is willingly supporting in that moment in history. Everything is the center of history. But he opens the door to the first martyr, who was very different in the face of that, Saint Stephen, who, as a result of the sacrifice that Christ made, which included bearing all that unhappiness. Now, I don't think Saint Stephen was, I only know what I've read, should we say, but I'm not guessing that he was pleased. Was he stoned to death, I think? But he was a martyr anyway in the Acts of the Apostle. But he was experiencing a joy because there was right at the deepest level, there was a source of joy and happiness. and that dominated his perception of how he was at that time. Now, that seems to be an extreme example. I hope I never have to be tested in the way that he was.
Right.
But I think by degrees, that is available to us. And it was that the suffering that he was experiencing, that was real. It didn't negate what he was experiencing. It is that there was a deeper and greater consolation was open to him that perhaps might not have been had he not made that sacrifice.
That's right. And that kind of brings us right back to Boethius, right? Because in the Consolation of Philosophy, you know, what's up with Boethius? Well, Boethius is in a dungeon. He's cold. He doesn't have any of his books. He's hungry. He's alone. And he feels sorry for himself, right? And that seems, you know, prima facie understandable. Here he is, the great philosopher, statesman, who does the just thing. And it doesn't get him a beautiful life. It lands him in a dungeon. And, you know, Lady Philosophy comes to him, and she appears to him as a doctor and diagnoses him with amnesia, right? You have forgotten what you know. And then, you know, it's a series of reminding him or reteaching him, or however you want to conceive of it, really of the truth of divine providence. And she makes the case through reason. She's Lady Philosophy, so she's not opening up the scripture. She makes the rational case. And this allows Boethius to contextualize his suffering properly. And that's, I think, what we've lost. We've lost the ability to understand the meaning of our suffering.
Right. So the question then is, how can we regain that? And I think that leads us nicely on what I hope might be another conversation that you and I will have. I have a feeling that it's the culture and literature might be part of that.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So let's talk about, I'd love to speak to you again about that. But for now, Jennifer, I just want to say thank you so much. But before you go, tell us how people can read your work. So you have a website. Just give us all the details there, so people who are curious, and I think many will be.
Okay. So I think most people who listen to your podcast, I'm just guessing, probably aren't philosophers. So they might not want to read like my academic stuff that I write for other philosophers. But if they do, you know, my website is jenniferandfrey.com, and that's where you can access all of that. But I do a lot of speaking and writing for non-philosophers. So I have a blog called thevirtueblog.com, where I write short, small essays about this kind of stuff. I'm a frequent speaker for the Thomistic Institute, which is run by the Dominicans of the Eastern Province in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And they have a SoundCloud account, just called, you know, it's like soundcloud.com/Thomistic Institute. And you can search for my talks, you know, talks on evil and sin and virtue and moral relativism and just all this stuff, just philosophy talks. And I have a podcast. My podcast is also on SoundCloud. It's called Sacred and Profane Love. And
Profane Love.
Sacred and Profane Love. And in this podcast, each episode, I just released episode 16 earlier today, but each episode explores a philosophical question through the lens of literature.
Wonderful.
And so, for instance, the episode that I released earlier today is on Shakespeare's really dark tragedy, King Lear.
I saw that on your blog. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so the topic was, what's the connection between love and perception? And we explore that through the philosophy of Plato and Iris Murdoch and King Lear and Shakespeare.
Iris Murdoch. Okay. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll put all of that on the notes that go with the podcast so that people can access all of that.
Okay, great.
And for now, I just want to say, Jennifer, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. So if you want to chat about literature sometime, you know where to find me.
We will. I'll take you up on that. You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.